The stench of stale sweat and fear clung to the air, heavy and suffocating. Clara didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the scuffed toes of her worn boots. The dust of the road had long since become a part of her, ingrained in the rough fabric of her dress, a constant reminder of the miles walked and the few, meager meals earned. She was 12 years old, but her back carried the burden of a woman thrice her age, a quiet ache that pulsed with every breath. Her father's voice, raspy and impatient, was a familiar sting. He stood before the tall, quiet rancher, a man whose shadow seemed to swallow the small piece of sun that dared to pierce the oppressive haze. The air crackled with a tension Clara understood without words, a currency of desperation she knew intimately. $60, her father had declared, his voice devoid of any warmth, any tremor of regret. $60 for 12 years of a life that had never truly been her own. Clara felt the familiar knot of shame tighten in her gut, a hot, bitter taste. She was not a person in that moment. She was a transaction, an item to be bartered, a means to an end for a man who saw her only as an extension of his own ruined prospects. Her hands, calloused and small, clenched at her sides. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into the dust that coated everything, to cease to exist under the weight of her father's callous disregard. He had sold her, plain and simple, like a mule or a plot of barren land. The world, it seemed, was determined to remind her just how unwanted she truly was. The rancher, Mr. Silas Thorne, was an enigma. He didn't boom or bluster like the men her father usually dealt with. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a strange stillness, a depth that unnerved her more than any shout. She had seen that look before too often from those who saw only her skin, her youth, her potential for endless toil. But this man was different. He didn't reach for his coin purse immediately. He didn't haggle. Instead, his voice, low and gravelly, cut through the oppressive silence. A question that shattered the practiced indifference Clara had built around her heart. "Girl," he said, his gaze meeting hers directly, holding it. "Do you want to come with me?" The words hung in the hot air, an impossible query. Her father coughed, a nervous, irritated sound. Her own breath hitched. He had bought her for $60, but he asked her permission first. It was a twist, a moral shift that felt like a sudden, dizzying drop. The choice, or the illusion of one, was hers. The world had always taken from her. It had never asked. This unexpected flicker of agency, however small, was a terrifying thing. It meant responsibility, a burden she didn't know if she could carry. Could she trust this strange, quiet man? Could she hope for a fragment of safety, a sliver of kindness, when her entire life had been defined by the absence of both? The question echoed in her mind, a fragile, desperate plea. What would happen next? Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The dust motes danced in the sparse sunlight that filtered through the rancher's wagon, illuminating Clara's clenched hands. Her answer had been a whisper, barely audible, a shaky yes that felt more like a prayer than a decision. What choice truly did she have? The familiar path led only to more hardship, more hunger, more of the endless, thankless labor that had already bent her young frame. Yet, the uncertainty of this new path was a cold knot in her stomach, a fear that gnawed at the edges of her tentative hope. She watched Silas Thorne from the corner of her eye, a man of few words, his profile etched against the stark, vast landscape. He drove the team of horses with a quiet competence, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he saw something beyond the dust and the endless stretch of dry land. She couldn't shake the memory of her father's face, etched with a fleeting expression of relief, then indifference, as the $60 exchanged hands. He had not looked back, not once, as she climbed into the wagon. That final, stark image of his retreating back was a fresh scar on her already wounded spirit. It was the latest in a long line of abandonments, each one a fresh reminder of her unwantedness. She had been passed from one distant relative to another after her mother died, each home a temporary reprieve, each face a mirror, reflecting her own growing sense of burden. The work had always been endless, the food scarce, and the warmth of true belonging a concept as foreign as the moon. She was just a mouth to feed, a pair of hands to exploit. Silas Thorne seemed to sense her unease, though he didn't speak. He simply nudged a burlap sack closer to her with his boot. "There's dried jerky in there," he said, his voice softer now, less formal than before. "And water." It was a simple offer, but the quiet act of provision, without expectation or demand, was a shocking balm. No one had ever simply given her something, without first extracting a pound of flesh. She hesitated, then slowly reached for the jerky, her fingers trembling slightly. The salt and the rich, smoky taste were a revelation after weeks of near starvation. It wasn't just the food. It was the quiet permission to eat, to nourish herself without having to earn it through immediate toil. She studied the rancher's hands as he held the reins, strong, calloused, but surprisingly gentle. They were farmer's hands, a working man's hands, yet they held no aggression, no immediate threat. She tried to discern his motives, to find the catch, the inevitable cruel twist. Why had he asked her permission? Why had he paid money for her, only to offer food without demanding labor? Was it some strange form of charity? Or was he a monster cloaked in quiet kindness? Her mind, accustomed to suspicion and survival, cycled through every dark possibility. The uncertainty was a heavy cloak, wrapping around her, suffocating the fragile spark of hope that the jerky had briefly ignited. She was still a child, but the world had taught her to be wary, to expect the worst, to always be ready to run. Her old life had left her with a deep, abiding fear, a sense of helplessness that clung to her like a second skin. The journey to Silas Thorne's ranch felt endless, though Clara knew it couldn't have been more than a few hours. Each bump in the road was a reminder of her precarious position, of the vast, unknown territory she was entering, both literally and figuratively. When the wagon finally pulled up to a small, unpainted house nestled amongst a cluster of old oak trees, she felt a strange mix of apprehension and a quiet awe. It wasn't a grand place, but it possessed a humble solitude, a sense of being rooted to the land. Unlike the transient camps and crowded shacks she had known, the silence of the plains stretched around them, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves. It was a silence that spoke of peace, yet also of an isolation that mirrored the loneliness she had carried within her for so long. Silas dismounted first, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He didn't offer her a hand down, which surprised her, but neither did he rush her. He simply waited, his presence a quiet anchor. When she finally swung her legs over the side and dropped to the dusty ground, he led her inside. The interior of the house was sparsely furnished but meticulously clean. A warmth radiated from a small wood stove, chasing away the evening chill. The scent of pine and something subtly earthy filled the air, a stark contrast to the stale smells of her past. She noticed the lack of a woman's touch, the absence of frills or unnecessary adornments. It was a man's home, functional and quiet. "You can have this room," he said, indicating a small space off the main living area. "It's not much, but it's yours." He pointed to a simple cot with a clean patched quilt and a small wooden chest at its foot. The words, "It's yours," echoed in her mind. Nothing had ever truly been hers. Not a bed, not a toy, not even a moment of peace. It was always temporary, always borrowed, always to be earned through arduous labor. The very concept of possession, of belonging, was foreign, almost unsettling. She ran her fingers over the quilt, feeling the soft, worn fabric. A wave of exhaustion, deep and bone-weary, washed over her. Silas left her alone, giving her space. She heard him moving around in the main room, stoking the fire, preparing a simple meal. There was no demand for help, no expectation of immediate work. This was a profound deviation from every single day she had ever known. Her ingrained sense of duty, of needing to prove her worth, made her feel restless, almost guilty. She wasn't used to stillness, to the absence of a whip-cracking voice or the constant need to please. Her body thrummed with a nervous energy, conditioned by years of abuse and the relentless pursuit of survival. Could this be real? Could a man simply be kind? The question was a fragile thing, born of a desperate hope, but it carried with it the heavy weight of suspicion. Her scars, both visible and invisible, pulsed with a quiet warning. She couldn't afford to trust, not truly, Not yet. The world had always taught her betrayal, never true safety. Days bled into weeks at the ranch. A slow, quiet rhythm that was profoundly unsettling in its peacefulness. Clara found herself observing Silas Thorne, always at a distance, trying to decipher the enigma of his character. He rose before dawn, his work ethic as steady and unwavering as the sunrise. He tended his cattle, repaired fences, worked the small garden patch. He never raised his voice, never demanded more than a quiet diligence from the few tasks he assigned her. She helped with the cooking, cleaned the house, and mended his worn clothes. The tasks were familiar, but the context was entirely new. There was no lash of urgency, no threat of hunger if the work wasn't perfect. She began to notice the small things, the unexpected kindnesses that chipped away at her carefully constructed defenses. He left a bowl of fresh berries on the table one morning, knowing she liked them. He brought back a piece of ribbon from town, a simple, dark blue, for her hair. Once, she stumbled carrying a bucket of water, spilling most of it. Instead of the expected reprimand, he simply took the bucket from her, refilled it himself, and said, "Careful, now. No need to rush." Each small act was a tiny tremor in the hardened earth of her distrust, a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. It was a strange sensation, this tentative warmth, both terrifying and alluring. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Silas sat on the porch, staring out at the vast land. Clara, finishing her chores, hesitated, then sat a respectful distance away. The silence stretched between them, comfortable rather than strained. "It's a lonely life out here," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. "But it's a good one, if you make it so." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer a dramatic backstory, but in his quiet admission, Clara sensed a shared understanding, a mirroring of the profound solitude she herself had known. He wasn't just a rancher. He was a man who understood loneliness. Perhaps intimately, she found herself, almost unconsciously, asking a question, something that had been burning in her for days. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why did you ask?" He turned his head slowly, his winter sky eyes meeting hers. There was no judgment in them, only a quiet depth. "No one should be bought and sold, child," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "No one. And certainly not without their say." He paused, then continued, his gaze drifting back to the horizon. "It ain't right. I reckoned you deserved a choice, however small it seemed." The truth of his words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't about charity. It was about dignity, about seeing her as a human being, not a commodity. The burden of shame, so deeply ingrained, felt momentarily lighter. A fragile seed of trust, nurtured by small acts of profound kindness, began to take root in the dry soil of her soul. Could this quiet man truly offer safety? Could she, for the first time, allow herself to truly hope? The seasons turned, marking time not just by the changing landscape, but by the quiet deepening of a bond Clara had never imagined possible. The daily rhythm of life on the ranch became a comforting balm. She learned to ride a horse, feeling the wind in her hair, a sensation of freedom she had only dreamed of. Silas taught her how to mend fences properly, how to tell when a calf was ailing, how to read the signs of an approaching storm in the restless wind. He didn't treat her as a fragile girl, but as a capable apprentice, slowly, patiently guiding her, trusting her with tasks of increasing importance. In his unspoken lessons, she found a validation that had been absent from her entire young life. Her hands, once calloused from relentless labor, now hardened with purpose. Her mind, once consumed by the need for survival, began to open, to observe, to understand. She saw the unwavering dedication Silas had for his land, for his animals, for the quiet existence he had carved out for himself. He was a man of routines, of quiet strength, and in his consistency, she found a bedrock of safety she had never known. The house, once just a roof over her head, began to feel like a home. The simple meals shared at the small wooden table felt like communion, a quiet affirmation of belonging. One bitterly cold winter evening, a fierce blizzard howled outside, rattling the window panes. The fire in the stove crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Clara sat by the hearth, mending a tear in Silas's work shirt, feeling the familiar warmth of the home. She remembered other winters, huddled in threadbare blankets and leaky shacks, the gnawing fear of cold and hunger. A wave of profound gratitude, so potent it made her throat ache, washed over her. She looked up at Silas, who was reading by the light of a kerosene lamp, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was not a father to her, not in the traditional sense, but he was more than just a benefactor. He was a quiet protector, a steadfast presence. She thought of the little girl she had been, the one who saw the world only as a series of threats and demands. That girl had been a desperate bird, forever searching for a safe branch, constantly on the brink of falling. Here, with Silas, she was beginning to find her footing. The emotional arc of despair had bent towards a quiet, tentative connection. She wasn't just working for him, she was part of his world, a quiet extension of his solitary life. The concept of family had always been a distant, painful memory, or an abstract dream, but now, in the quiet hum of the ranch house, in the shared silences and unspoken understandings, a new definition was slowly, gently taking shape. It wasn't blood that bound them, but kindness, respect, and a mutual, unspoken recognition of each other's profound loneliness, slowly replaced by a sense of found belonging. The quiet peace of the ranch, however profound, existed in a world that was far from quiet. The small town of Haven, a cluster of buildings just a few miles down the dusty road, had a way of watching, of judging, of forming opinions based on whispers and assumptions. Clara had sensed it from her first trip into town with Silas. A subtle tightening of lips, a fleeting dart of eyes, quickly averted but not missed. It was the familiar weight of community judgment, a collective gaze that bore down on anything or anyone perceived as different, as out of place. A white rancher, living alone, suddenly with a young black girl, barely a woman, under his roof. The narrative spun itself in their minds, twisted and ugly, far from the truth of quiet compassion. Mrs. Gable, the self-appointed matriarch of the church bake sale committee, was the most vocal. Her eyes, sharp and unforgiving, would bore into Clara every time they passed on the boardwalk. "Seems Silas Thorne's taken in more than just a stray dog," she'd mutter to her cronies, loud enough to be overheard. The words were laced with venom, implying moral decay, a transgression against the perceived order of things. Clara felt the familiar burn of shame, the old accusation of being unwanted, of being somehow less, resurfacing. Her desperation, her former vulnerability, was being mistaken for weakness, and worse, for something illicit. Silas, ever stoic, rarely reacted to these thinly veiled barbs. He simply tightened his grip on Clara's shoulder, a silent affirmation of his protection, or steered her away from the gossiping knots of women. But the whispers grew louder, the stares more direct. The general store owner, usually jovial, grew stiff and quiet when Silas and Clara entered together. Children, mimicking their parents, pointed and whispered, "That's the girl from Thorne's ranch." The innocence of youth could be as cruel as any adult's malice when fueled by prejudice. The external threat was not a storm on the horizon, but a storm brewing in the narrow minds of the town, a storm of prejudice and suspicion. It was a pressure that built slowly, incrementally, eroding the fragile sense of belonging Clara had begun to cultivate. She saw the burden of it in the subtle lines around Silas's eyes, the way his jaw would clench, almost imperceptibly. He was bearing the brunt of their judgment, not just for himself, but for her, for the choice he had made. The moral tension between his quiet freedom and the town's need for conformity grew taut. Clara felt a profound sense of unease. Had she brought this upon him? Was her presence causing him trouble, risking the quiet life he cherished? The old, deep-seated fear of being a burden returned, a suffocating weight. She had found a measure of safety, a flicker of peace, but now it felt precarious, threatened by the very community she had hoped to integrate into, even peripherally. The risk was not just to her, but to Silas, to the quiet haven they had built together. The dark clouds of communal judgment gathered, ready to break. The storm finally broke on a crisp autumn afternoon. Not a storm of wind and rain, but of human indignation, led by the formidable Mrs. Gable. She arrived at the ranch unannounced, her face set in a mask of righteous disapproval, flanked by Deacon Miller and a stern-faced representative from the County Orphans Board. The sight of their buggy pulling up the dusty lane sent a chill through Clara, a familiar premonition of trouble, of her world once again being upended. She felt a familiar tremor of fear, the primal instinct to hide, to make herself invisible. Her hands began to tremble. Silas met them on the porch, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He offered no welcome, simply a quiet presence that spoke of an unyielding resolve. "Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Gable began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We've come on behalf of the community, concerned about certain irregularities." Her gaze flicked to Clara, who stood just behind Silas, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Specifically, the girl. Clara, isn't it?" The deacon cleared his throat nervously. "We've had reports, Mr. Thorne. Concerns about her welfare, about her circumstances." The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air. They believed he was exploiting her, that their relationship was scandalous, perhaps even dangerous. Silas's voice was low, but it carried an edge Clara had never heard before. "Clara is safe here. She works, yes, but she eats well, sleeps warm, and she has a choice. More choice than she ever had before." He didn't explain the full truth of her past, knowing it would only fuel their twisted narrative, but his quiet defense was a shield, a bulwark against their invasive judgment. The board representative, a thin man with spectacles, stepped forward. "Mr. Thorne, we understand you purchased her, but this is irregular. We have a responsibility to ensure all children are in suitable homes. It may be best if she were placed with a proper family, perhaps in town, where she could receive a proper upbringing." The words struck Clara like a physical blow. A proper family. They meant a family like theirs, a family that would see her as a burden, as something to be controlled and exploited, not cherished. Her heart cried out against the injustice, against their willful blindness. They saw only their own prejudice, never the kindness, the safety, the belonging she had found. She felt the choice weighing heavily on her, to speak up, to defend Silas, or to submit to their authority, to be taken away to an unknown future that would likely be worse than the one she had escaped. Her loyalty was tested, not just to Silas, but to the fragile hope they had built together. Silas stood firm, his gaze unwavering. "She is in a suitable home," he stated, his voice quiet but absolute. "This is her home, and she chooses to be here." He turned, and in a gesture that surprised them all, he placed his hand firmly, gently, on Clara's shoulder. "Isn't that right, Clara?" He looked at her, his eyes asking not for a lie, but for her truth, her affirmation. In that moment, the threat was palpable, the community judgment a menacing cloud. Her future, and his, hung in the balance. Clara looked at Silas, then at the faces of Mrs. Gable, Deacon Miller, and the board representative, their expressions a mixture of self-righteousness and ill-concealed disapproval. A lifetime of fear, of being unwanted, threatened to pull her back into silence. But Silas's hand on her shoulder, firm and warm, was an anchor. His quiet strength, his unwavering belief in her, in their shared truth, gave her a courage she hadn't known she possessed. She thought of the fresh berries, the blue ribbon, the patient lessons, the simple, profound kindnesses that had transformed her despair into a hesitant hope. "Yes," she said, her voice small at first, but then gaining strength, ringing clear in the sudden, tense silence. "Yes, this is my home, and I choose to be here." Her gaze met Mrs. Gable's, holding it without flinching. "He has given me kindness," she continued, "and safety, more than I've ever known." It was not a plea. It was a quiet, profound affirmation, a statement of fact that cut through the prejudice and assumptions like a sharp knife. Her eyes, once downcast, now held a fierce, quiet dignity. She was not a victim. She was a girl who had made a choice. Silas nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, acknowledging her brave declaration. His eyes, fixed on the townspeople, held a quiet challenge. "She ain't property," he stated, his voice calm. "And she ain't a burden. She's family. And I won't have her badgered, not by anyone." It was not a heroic shout, not a dramatic stand, but a quiet, unwavering affirmation of loyalty. He sacrificed his comfortable anonymity, his standing in the community, for her. He was choosing her, publicly, unequivocally, against the very currents of societal expectation. The board representative shifted uncomfortably, his professional demeanor crumbling under the weight of Clara's direct honesty and Silas's unyielding resolve. Mrs. Gable huffed, her face flushing with indignation, but the moral ground had shifted beneath her feet. They had come to accuse, to dismantle, but they were met not with guilt, but with quiet conviction. There was no scandal, only a profound act of human connection. The unspoken accusation of exploitation was shattered by the simple truth of belonging. Deacon Miller, looking uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "Well, Mr. Thorne, we have heard your statement. And, Clara's, we will take this under advisement." It was a retreat, a grudging admission of defeat. They had come for a public shaming, perhaps even to remove Clara, but they left with nothing but the quiet affirmation of a bond they couldn't comprehend. The rancher and the girl, standing together on their porch, a silent testament to a loyalty that defied their narrow world. The threat had been faced, not with violence, but with quiet truth, and for the first time, Clara felt truly, irrevocably, not broken. She was loved, and that was enough. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation with the town committee brought a new kind of quiet to the ranch, one deeper than before. The whispers didn't entirely cease in Haven, but they lessened, becoming duller, less potent. The moral authority of Mrs. Gable and her ilk had been subtly undermined, their accusations having found no purchase against the solid, unyielding truth presented by Silas and Clara. Some in the town, perhaps out of grudging respect for Silas's quiet stand, or perhaps out of a flicker of genuine empathy, began to simply leave them alone. Clara's scars, both seen and unseen, didn't vanish overnight. The years of abandonment, of being unwanted, of feeling like a burden, had left deep marks on her spirit. But the healing had begun, slow and steady, like a deep-rooted tree slowly mending itself after a harsh winter storm. She still carried the weight of her past, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it was a reminder of how far she had come, of the profound transformation wrought by a single man's kindness and the choice she had made. The fear of false accusations still lingered, a phantom ache, but it was overshadowed by a burgeoning sense of security. Their connection deepened further. There were moments when Silas, usually so reticent, would share a quiet memory of his own past, of loneliness or a hardship faced alone. In those shared silences, Clara realized that he too had carried burdens, perhaps different in nature, but equally heavy. They were two solitary souls, bound by an unspoken understanding, finding solace and strength in each other's presence. He didn't try to fix her, to erase her past, but simply to provide a safe space for her to grow, to be. He saw her, truly saw her. Beyond the societal labels and the circumstances of her arrival, the ranch became more than a shelter. It became a sanctuary, a place where the wild, untamed beauty of nature mirrored the resilience of their spirits. The ancient oak trees that sheltered the house stood strong against the wind, their roots deeply entwined, much like the bond between Silas and Clara. The vast, open skies above them were a constant reminder of freedom, of possibility. She learned to find beauty in the quiet moments, the rustle of leaves, the distant lowing of cattle, the warmth of the sun on her face, as she worked alongside Silas. The concept of a proper family still held an odd significance for some in town. But for Clara, family was no longer a matter of blood or societal convention. It was built on trust, on kindness, on unwavering loyalty, on the choice to stay, to protect, to belong. It was a quiet triumph, not a heroic battle, but a deep, resonant peace. The ache of desperation had receded, replaced by a quiet strength. The past was a part of her, but it no longer held her captive. She was not broken, but healing, slowly, beautifully, day by quiet day, under the watchful, kind eyes of Silas Thorne. Years later, the little girl who had been sold for $60 stood taller, her shoulders straighter, her eyes clear and full of a quiet resolve. Clara was no longer a child, but a capable young woman, her hands strong from work, her spirit unburdened by the pervasive shame that had once defined her. The ranch, once a place of uncertainty, had become the bedrock of her life. a testament to the profound power of found belonging. Silas Thorne, now older, his movements a little slower, remained her steadfast anchor, his quiet presence a constant source of strength and unwavering kindness. Their bond had deepened beyond words, a silent understanding forged in shared hardship and unwavering loyalty. The town of Haven had changed too, subtly but irrevocably. The initial shock and judgment surrounding Silas and Clara had faded, replaced by a grudging acceptance, then by something akin to respect. They had defied the town's narrow expectations, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet, persistent truth of their lives. Clara, through her hard work and dignity, had earned the respect of those who had once whispered about her. She became a familiar, trusted sight in town, no longer seen as the girl from Thorne's ranch with suspicion, but simply as Clara, a part of their landscape. However unconventional her story, the quiet wins, the ones that mattered most, were etched into the very fabric of their days. It wasn't a heroic triumph, but the choice to stay, to build, to protect each other against the world's harsh judgments. Clara, now a formidable helpmate on the ranch, never forgot the desperation that had brought her to Silas's door. But that memory no longer fueled her fear. It fueled her gratitude, her understanding of the preciousness of safety and genuine connection. She often thought of the children still trapped in situations like hers, the innocents in danger, and a quiet resolve settled within her to, one day, perhaps make a difference, however small. Their story, lived out in the open plains, became a quiet challenge to the prevailing prejudices of the time. It wasn't a loud declaration, but a lived example of how kindness could dismantle deeply entrenched hatred, how humanity could blossom in the most unexpected of places. The community judgment had been a fire, but their unwavering loyalty had forged them, making their bond unbreakable. Silas had sacrificed his solitary peace to offer her a home, and in turn, Clara had brought life and a new purpose to his quiet existence. There was a bittersweet note to their peace, a haunting understanding that the scars of the past, though faded, would always remain. But they were reminders, not burdens. Clara had learned that she was not broken, that her worth was not defined by the circumstances of her birth or the cruelty of others, but by her spirit, her choices, and the profound love she had found. Their journey had not been a simple one, but it was one of affirmation, of healing, and of an enduring hope that even in the harshest landscapes, belonging could be found, fostered by the quiet, transformative power of one man's unwavering kindness and one girl's brave choice. The ranch, once just a dot on the horizon, became a beacon of quiet change that, in its own way, had changed the whole town.